understood their place in society, but they were also politically conscious to the realities outside of the church. And so today, many years later, the movement of Fees Must Fall, the choir adverts, it adopts this same hymn. It becomes, in the Republic of South Africa, an anthem. But in 2015, 2016, 2017, when the youth, you, are coming and saying, fees must fall, school must be accessible for all, we still somehow remember that there is a need to call the prayer to heal South Africa. Can the church detach itself from politics? Our history in answering the call to change society, to seek an alternative community for the better, supersedes our own understanding. It's not only the fact that sinentshisakalo to see change in our personal lives, but it's that we exist in a society that forces us to make the political personal. Can the church detach itself from politics? And so this hymn has since reverberated through generations and generations, and seemingly all of those generations knew that they had a call to answer. Nkosi Sigelela i-Africa, because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so today, part of what I would like to achieve is to draw just a clear picture on how the state, the law, and the church work together to show that there is a positivity and the direction in which South African politics is headed is necessary for all parties to coexist. Part of what I would like to achieve today is to draw a clear picture on how faith has sustained both the Christian faith-believing person and the politically conscious person in their commitment to an alternative community or to change. And I would like to highlight for us what are some of the core characteristics that are similar between these two people, the politically conscious and the faith-based person. And in this aspect, I'd like to just address something that is often overlooked, and that is conviction. South Africa is a result of colonial conquest, a result of apartheid, and currently a result of mismanaged governance. But somehow, 80% of this secular state still says, I choose God as my guide and my moral compass. And so in remaining hopeful, these faith-based institutions understand that the imminent unemployment, the femicide, the wealth gap, even at the core of all of these issues, as if in our daily life, God has to be the center to sustain us. And so before we even go ahead, in political science, there are different definitions on what politics is, and they differ according to each generations of academics, right? The Oxford Dictionary says politics may be defined as social relations that involve authority or power. Max Weber, a German sociologist, says that politics is the independent leadership action, in action. Harold Laswell says, and makes it simple for all of us to understand, Harold Laswell says, politics determines who gets what, when, and how, and why. And so while these definitions make sense for a political science background, I want to just offer a different perspective that might relate to some people out. And the African experience of politics in South Africa particularly, it means community. It means understanding that your experience of politics is deeply intertwined with the social realities of those who we trust to handle our government. And so I think it is necessary to say, for the average black person in South Africa, politics is personal. Politics is a necessity, whether you would like to participate or not. ndizise apha kuthi as the youth of the Methodist Church. One of our founders, John Wesley, discusses how his own mission when he felt in Chisakalo at Aldersgate in response to the circumstances in the church and the Anglican values that he had, while at the time Calvinist theories were exactly what were deciding how society and governance will go. John Wesley says, I don't only want to do this idea of doctrine and saying this is what the Bible says. John Wesley says, I want a faith-based mission. And so today when we sit here and this is Manyana Nale movement, we understand that our goal is not only to bring the message to Abantu to say God is the way that you should be going, but in the societies that we live in, we should be the change that we would like to see, that God wants to see in us. And so when we speak about the main characteristics of a person who is a political participant, as a person who is a church member, we understand that the church's role in the generation that fought for the democratic South Africa always reflects what you as the youth today get to benefit from. But how do you use that gift? How do you use that gift usefully? How do you use that gift to effect the change that you need? Xa uvuka ekuseni ulayite ikhandlela, ubeke iketile, uhlambe, ulungiselele uyofeyisana ne-circumstances zokuphangela okanye ezofunda. What is it that you need to sustain you when you have to take iteksi yokuqala, uphinde utshintshe uthele iteksi yosibini, and then uyofika emsebenzini and do the same thing? That kind of way of living, it calls for you to reflect truthfully. What is it that sustains you to keep on going? And so when we look at John Wesley and his mission as ideals, it emphasized his spiritual conviction and social responsibility. He believed in civic engagement, not necessarily as a way of defining the state in the same way that a monarchy would do it, right? But as a way to influence moral leadership. And so this movement at the time was radical in style and substance, focusing on community outreach as well as reform and spiritual practice before just delivering the doctrine. And so I think one of the main ways that are relevant when you look at reflecting how far or how much the church contributes to politics, whether the church can detach itself, is looking at how Christianity existed during ixesha le-apartheid, which is most relevant to most of us, right? Siyayazi lo history. During apartheid, right, Christianity was both an ideological justification for the system of apartheid, where churches of Calvinist traditions said, because God has called us, we want to segregate according to this superiority lexicon. It is to say, this Christianity and this God that we know says that if you are of a certain race, you are more superior and closer to God, and therefore segregation makes sense. But at the same time, there existed our parents, our people who gave birth to us, and that same Christianity was a source of strength and resistance for those who were fighting the apartheid system. I recently read a book, Thuli Madonsela, and in her book, Thuli Madonsela says something very interesting. She highlights the importance of Omama Bomthandazo by explaining indoba during the 70s and the 60s, while apartheid was deeply enforcing its law, right? Omama who worked emakhitshini for the white dominant race in the towns, they would leave Soweto, they would leave Davidton, they would leave Dobsonville, bayohlala kulamakhaya, and raise kids and live a political life that was akin to what the South Africa of the time understood. But uti, there was one day, and that was a Thursday. And this Thursday, bonke abelungu babebakhulula omama bethu abaphangela emakhitshini notata babephangela ezigadini. And on that day, they would open specific spaces It was called Sheila's Day Romance. So the ladies would dress up, the ladies would be donning in their dresses, and kuyodityanwa ngomanyano, kuyodibanisa abantu kuzothiwa istokfela sethu sime kanje. But at the same time, the gents would don their favorite suits, they would fix their hair, kudityanwe bakini. But the most important thing is that they would say, Nkosi sikelela i-Afrika. And they would meet in prayer to say, outside of these circumstances, we can experience love. Outside of these circumstances, we can experience growth. Outside of these circumstances, we can still call on God because we're sustained by that faith in God. And one example of Sheila's Day is to say the political definitely is personal, but at the core of it, the conviction to see change in your own life does not come in our own understanding, but it's something that supersedes us. What John Wesley says is spiritual conviction. Another example where the position of the church is emphasized is in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what happens is that they call abantu abazi victims, they call the families, and it's a moment yoba makuthethwe kwenzeka lento kumngale date kwathi. But ultimately, in order to see a South Africa where people can coexist, bayabuza intoba who exactly is going to guide the new South Africa on the ground? And they say, actually, let's call the church. Let's call the church and hear what has been happening in those buildings while abantu abamnyama bephethe kakhulu. And so the church becomes an instrumental part in guiding exactly what is called the moral fiber under which the state in and of itself wants to look at how the new South Africa will operate. This then pushes the narrative, or it emphasizes the fact that the church and Christianity was both an ideological justification and a source of strength. So if you look at the characteristics of umdu who is faith-based or who has committed themselves to an institution of faith, and someone who has committed themselves to political participation, the first thing is conviction and common purpose. Now, conviction and common purpose ibonakala in the sense that akho mntu okupushayo after a certain age ba joina unorosette uphume kunorosette ungene kwi-guild uphume kwi-guild ube yinto ethile. That is more like a culture that gets embedded, but the choice to be here today on a Friday is what we see in convicting, or the conviction in which young people like yourselves have chosen. And so the people who say, I choose a certain political path, or I would like to sign this petition because Umdotile has wronged society, that is conviction and a common purpose to come together. Then the second characteristics that I would like to highlight is choice and differentiation. A choice and differentiation between these two kinds of people says, look, silapha, we've decided that we've committed to this. But how do we set ourselves apart? How do we say siqala phi, siphela phi? And those sets of rules apply both in a political meeting as well as in the church. And so when you look at the fact that rules, the way that is what says if you go across this line, you are no longer in the space where we have come together with conviction and common purpose. And so with that comes a call to respond, choice and differentiation, and it actually sets out social norms, ethics, values that respond to the poor governance that we experience on planet. And so these two characteristics are exactly what we need to identify when we want to answer the question, can the church detach itself from politics? And so I want to do something, but I need 3 volunteers. Just to show how exactly this idea of the church, the law, and the state So, there are 3 volunteers. So, just quickly. I'm going to illustrate something. Thanks. Have your loads.
Face your consultation.
2. 3.
Oh, I get
Okay, you can just face the So to drive this point and to understand if there's anything ozailibala namhlanje, the relationship between the law, the state, and the church is analogous, and it's only in the case of South Africa. There are democracies that don't need the system that you're looking in front of you. Ubudi will be the law, Usisi will be the state, Usisi Wesbini will be the church. Okay. So ubudi represents the law that sets the rules of operation in the society. Sele inabantu. Bakhona abantu, the territorial borders are already set, but the letter of the law ibhalwa phaya ngabuya bodi. Sisi wesibini. Usisi represents the state. So the state is an accumulation of territory, which is umhlaba, to say from this border, Lesotho xa siqala kulele gate, then ibe South Africa xa siqala kulele gate, laa nto kuthiwa yi-territory. Then ke ngoku that territory, in order for it to be legitimate, we need a law. Do you see? And then with the population that is there is authority. And so Usisi is now the church. And so the church in and of itself in South Africa particularly, right, which is a secular state, but 80% of the people have faith-based morals. Usisi represents a moral and an ideological state. In these are the two. I don't know, is this mic moving? No? Does it move? Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. So, if we were to say Udi, who is the? Let's show them all this mechanism. This is who is the state, and this is who is the church. So, if we say to Udi, who is the law, sit down, we only need the state and the church, right? What happens is that in apartheid, realistically, yes, there was a law, but parliamentary power superseded how exactly the state was run. And so the ideology that led to understanding how are we going to implement the law said that God is sovereign, God is the way, and the God that we have decided says that we're superior. So what then happens is that if the church and the state come together and they set both the politics and the ideology, we run the risk, thank you very much, we run the risk of only answering to the authority of a warm body, Jan van Riebeck being one of those warm bodies, who can wake up one day and say, oh, you know what, I'm not in the mood for this anymore. Actually, 80% of the land belongs to us now. That's the risk that we run when we say we're only going to deal with the state and the church. Because the state in and of itself does not only become this faith-based inhibition or this faith-based conviction rather, it also becomes a way of operating how everyone who's seated here will do things on the day. And it can change because the representatives that we've been given are people who are warm-bodied, right? And upon their untimely death, and upon their death, we cease to understand how will we organize the state. Do you understand? And so let's say, okay, you know what, we don't actually need you anymore. Let's look at the law and the state. So what happens when we say, okay, we no longer need an institution that is based on a moral compass, we probably just only need this big constitution that is in Pretoria, that is a bunny page, or you know what, if you murder someone, you're going to go straight to get hanged, right? I will call any interpretation of the realities of Abantu on the ground. So what the law says is what the law is on the book. And up until we see the law affecting Abantu, up until we see the people for their realities and their personal experiences, the law says, listen, state, you've got the territory, if Sister Songi decides she's wearing pink and we don't wear pink in this country, we're going to jail her with no interpretation, with no reflection. And so that's why today we find that our constitution, or the way in which South Africa as a state and the politics operate, says we're going to look at what the moral fiber says, so that when you do something that is outside of the law, the interpretation will say, murder is the intention to kill, but how did it happen? What were the circumstances? So the interpretation at a court level looks at interpreting not only what the law says, right, within the state, it also says, what are the circumstances that could have led for this person to murder? And so with that, we see that this union is a necessary chain, because it guides the moral compass within a territory in order to say the law can change and grow to reflect the moral compass to maintain the sovereignty of the state. So, thank you so much. So then, if we are to move from the apartheid idea, this idea of it was the apartheid people who fought so valiantly for the law and the access to the land that we have, right? That made sure that segregation is not just, the borders that says you can only be in Transkei if you are a certain demographic, but understanding that segregation was also an inhibition of the South. It went to the gravity of making the need for sustaining society almost impossible. And so this generational mandate that needs to be answered when we say Nkosi sikeleli Afrika, we need to decide what our mandate is that will make sure that outside of these four walls, how are we exercising the gift of democracy at a time where we are experiencing poor governance? So we see the implementation of project work and outreaches to say, when the government fails in providing sanitary towels, this movement creates a quick one. And I've been in leadership, you'll just say, I realized Papa is struggling with and then you put it in a meeting, and then in the meeting it gets decided, and this beautiful movement comes together, brings together resources, but it leaves this church, and it reaches out to the community as well as a result of the mishaps of poor governance. Can the church be detached from politics? So that level of participation, yes, also regalia and sing the struggle songs, but it is an important part in democracy. It's a form of public participation. And so going forward, how does this youth see lo msebenzi niwenzayo ningacelwanga mntu? How do you implement it to reflect the alternative community that you want? And in a democracy, anyone who studies political science knows that you have to vote. You have to vote. You absolutely have to vote. The question is not who am I going to vote for. The question is when am I going to take part in the change that I want to see. That is why you're voting. And so the lack political participation in our generation, I know people always say, the youth is not voting, and the reason that they're not voting is because they never fought the struggle. We have our own struggles. We are a youth that has studied, has entered the walls, but majority of us, asiphangeli kwezindawo sizifundele. That is a challenge. That is a challenge that creates an inhibition internally. But when you are here, you understand that there is a conviction that keeps you going despite all of that. And so leaving voting means that you're also rubber stamping. That is to say, we are vumelana with leaving the most vulnerable of society at a disadvantage. And so if there are any questions on who to vote for, you must always say, to what extent are you willing to leave your future to be attended by the governing officials? And so while the foundations of our politics may be considered as northbound, as in we're waiting for the global politics to say what is next in our democracy, we are the youth that should wish to create an alternative community. Even through our social media, our public visibility says to people, it is okay to participate in this movement and say God is what guides you every day. But when we say justice for COGHDWG, you're going to sign that petition. Because politics is personal and the personal is political. And so, as I close today, I just want us to just remember, we are actually the generation that said fees must fall. And fees did fall. We are the generation that creates petitions in 2 minutes and the ministers respond. We are the generation that is redefining popular music. We're the generation that's redefining faith worship and the way that we're doing that. We are also dominating the sports arena, and we are actually influencing global politics. Indeed, we really are realizing the dreams of our ancestors.